We begin tonight with President Obama's announcement of his second major escalation of the 8-year-old conflict in Afghanistan. Speaking at West Point to an assembly of cabinet secretaries and generals and West Point officials and cadets and their families, President Obama ended a 92-day review of the war by explaining his new strategy, including the deployment of 30,000 additional U.S. troops will be in place in the war zone by the end of August. By then, there will be approximately 100,000 U.S. forces in Afghanistan. The escalation will begin early next year. The president then laid out a conditions-based timeline for when he expects U.S. troops to begin withdrawing from Afghanistan. There's no stated date by which troops will be gone from Afghanistan, the way there is in Iraq, but the president said tonight that the American departure will begin not next summer, but the summer after that, in July 2011.
As president, I refuse to set goals that go beyond our responsibility, our means, or our interests. And I must weigh all of the challenges that our nation faces. I don't have the luxury of committing to just one. We can't simply afford to ignore the price of these wars. But as we end the war in Iraq and transition to Afghan responsibility, we must rebuild our strength here at home. Our prosperity provides a foundation for our power. It pays for our military, it underwrites our diplomacy, it taps the potential of our people and allows investment in new industry, and it will allow us to compete in this century as successfully as we did in the last. That's why our troop commitment in Afghanistan cannot be open-ended, because the nation that I'm most interested in building is our own.
NBC's chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel watched the president's speech with American troops at Camp Eggers in Afghanistan. He joins us now from there. Richard, thanks very much for being with us. Really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. I'm here in a dining facility at Camp Eggers, and the troop reaction has been fairly positive. This is something that they wanted. They wanted the reinforcements. They've been asking for quite a long time. And there had been considerable frustration that this announcement hadn't come sooner, but now that it has come, and it's roughly what the commanders on the ground were asking for, 30,000 American, maybe 5,000 or more additional NATO forces, they seem to be satisfied.
In terms of the difference that this change will make in the lives of the average American soldier on the ground in Afghanistan, what's seen as more consequential to the troops there? Would the increase in boots on the ground or the timeline for at least starting to end the war?
Probably the timeline and also how the new troops will be operating. There is a general sense that the days of the tiny remote outposts on a mountaintop could be ending, and that U.S. troops and NATO troops are going to be consolidating in the population centers. So that's a different way of operating, and this is for the first time we've heard any talk of a timeline. And for a lot of troops, that has been a very welcome news, because if you are fighting a long war, an open-ended conflict, that can be a real morale killer as people try and plan their lives, plan their futures, plan with their families.
Richard, since you have been there on this latest trip, and since we've known sort of at least the generalities of what's been expected from the president, are you able to give us any sense of reaction from the Afghan people, whether or not this makes any difference to them in terms of the way they perceive Americans?
The Afghans are sitting on the fence at this stage. A lot of people in this country have seen many wars. They've seen troop surges come and go by the Taliban, by the Soviets, and they are not completely convinced that you're going to have a quick military solution to this conflict. They're also very skeptical that U.S. forces will be able to push the Taliban out of the villages. They think they can do that, but then hand over those villages to Afghan security forces. So right now, the Afghan security forces aren't up to the job, and when that's happened in the past, the Afghan police and army simply haven't done their jobs, haven't represented the government, and the areas have just fallen back into chaos.
One very specific reference the president made tonight was to the promised American support if the Afghan government wants to talk to essentially reconcilable Taliban who want to have a constructive role in the future of their country and to renounce violence. Is that likely to be seen as a controversial assertion in Afghanistan among the Afghan people?
Not at all. Particularly in southern Afghanistan, there is a big push. People want reconciliation, and that is one of the key things that I think people don't understand. Unlike in Iraq, where people hated the militant groups that were fighting, here the Taliban is unpopular. Only about 6% of the people want the Taliban to come back. But they're not seen as occupiers, or they're not seen as outsiders. They're seen as part of the society here that should be brought back into the fold. They're not mostly, the Taliban are not by and large attacking civilians in this country. So going once again to compare to Iraq, you had market bombings, al-Qaeda militants that were killing civilians by the dozens every single day. Here, it's mostly a conflict between the Taliban and foreign forces in this country. People are hoping that there can be some sort of reconciliation between the two.
Richard, one last quick logistical question, and it's something that's come up a lot today when the president announced that this troop increase would be phased in much more quickly than people previously expected. Do you think that's going to pose a logistical problem just in terms of what it takes to move 30,000 troops into Afghanistan over a period of 6 months and to have the transport and other infrastructure needed to move them to where they need to be in country?
No, I don't think that's something that will be a major problem. This dining facility is a tent, after all. These tents can be put up quickly. People can bunk up extra. The U.S. military is very good at that kind of thing, so I don't think it'll be a major problem.
NBC's chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel joining us from Camp Eggers in Afghanistan. Richard always seems to be joining us at obscene hours from dangerous places, for which we are always very grateful. Richard, thanks for your time.
Pleasure.